right? Because sometimes you hire a rep, it's not working out well. You're like, are they not good? Are our leads bad? Do we not have the right messaging? Is my product crappy? Am I a terrible leader? Like you have all these externals. It's like hard for me to point the finger at this person, right? Because everything else is chaotic. So you never want to be in that situation. And you need to be taking your experience with that sales rep and referencing the ideal candidate profile and make sure that they check all of the boxes. So there's a bunch of ways to do this, but you should map out the characteristics that you're looking for in a salesperson, and what level of experience that you want. Are they more motivated by money or more motivated by their career, right? You should map out what that person looks like, what their motivators are, what kind of experience do they have? Do they have a book of business or do they not? And then you should also consider their past history of success. Right? And you say, okay, yeah, this person is a lot more career motivated, which might be good for me at the time because I would like to hire someone that I can see progressing within the organization. But sometimes you don't. Sometimes you're like, I need somebody money motivated to just execute on the thing day in and day out. I don't need them getting creative with different scripts. I need them to execute on this playbook.
Welcome to Business Breakthroughs. I'm your host, Mark Hawkridge. Today, my guest is Kyle Vamvouris, the CEO of Vouris, a B2B sales consulting firm for early-stage companies needing to build, refine, manage their sales motions. Kyle is an experienced and accomplished salesperson himself, a sales leader, data-driven problem solver. He's known for transforming sales processes and teams, for strategic hiring and onboarding, and speaking on all things sales-related. He's also the author of 2 best-selling books on B2B sales. Kyle, it's great to have you on the show, and I'm looking forward to geeking out with you about sales.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. I love nerding out about this topic.
Fantastic. Well, why don't we start with just maybe hearing a little bit more about your own journey in sales? I mean, you started, I believe, as an SDR and built yourself all the way through the different ranks of, AE and then managing. And kind of what led to your passion for sales, and when did you decide to start helping others achieve sales success?
Totally. Well, I'll give you the short version of the story. I get passionate about a lot of things. So I'm someone with no shortage of energy. And when I was going to college, I wasn't doing very well. I decided to drop out to do stand-up comedy. I'd done stand-up comedy since I was 17, and I did it for a total of 5 years. And while I was doing stand-up, I got a job selling gym memberships at a local gym in some area.
Yeah.
So I started off gym sales, and that's a very transactional person to person. You're selling to consumers, very different than selling to businesses. So I often say like my first real sales experience was when I started as an SDR at a company called Demand Force. It was owned by Intuit at the time. Intuit makes QuickBooks TurboTax for those who aren't familiar. So anyway, I started there as an SDR. After 10 months, was promoted to an account executive where I was a direct salesperson, and so I was selling to salons and spas. Very transactional sales. So I sort of started my sales journey in this high volume, making 100, 120 cold calls a day, and then also 1 call closes. From there, I went and started selling enterprise level, but this was early on, call center software, which was more of a mid-market sale. Very difficult jump. And anybody who has a background with running sales teams or hiring salespeople know it is pretty difficult to take somebody who has enterprise experience and bring them down and have them start selling transactional. And then it's difficult to take someone who's transactional and pull them up to enterprise. Mid-market, you have a little bit more float, but it is a big learning curve. So I went through that learning curve, learned a lot, closed some great deals there. Some of my largest deals were closed as a direct salesperson were closed there. From there, I decided to write a book. That was called Cold to Committed. It's a book just about cold calling, doing cold outreach. There weren't very many at the time when I wrote the book. So that's why I did it. I felt like I was a good person to speak on this topic because I had done it for quite a bit. And from there, I started running teams. So I ran an SDR team at an early stage startup company based out of San Francisco. I was number 24. We had 3 SDRs at the time. By the time I left, we had 17 SDRs. And we had gone from, we were a fintech company, so assets under management was our goal. We went from 124-ish million in assets under management to over $1 billion in 20 months, which is really
fast growth.
That industry. So from there, I went and ran the inside sales team at a global supply chain software company. Now that was a pure enterprise sales, selling $1 million annual contracts. ran the inside sales team there, and then decided to start my own company when COVID hit. So that's the real quick version of my background.
Yeah.
Most positions that you can have in the sales process, but what I find the most value in, especially like from that perspective as a frontline salesperson, and I understand those challenges there. I've been poorly enabled before, so I get what that looks like. My big learning was really around the data and the operations. I was so much a people leader early on when I started running teams. I was very rah, get the people fired up. What's the goal? Drive towards the result. Tons of value in that persona. Incredibly valuable, but we kept bumping our heads against operations challenges. And like I said, I dropped out of college. I failed every math class I ever took. So I didn't have that skill set early on. Once I developed it, the whole world kind of changed because I had a mechanism to identify bottlenecks and fix them, when before it was like throwing darts at a dartboard with my eye blindfold, you know? So
Right.
anyway, that's sort of the quick run through of the journey.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the data part of that is interesting to me. And I mean, is that where you think that most B2B companies struggle in developing efficient and effective teams? Is it around that data analysis and just having the instrumentation to make better decisions and drive the team?
I think it's a pretty big variable. It's up there with culture of the sales team, but especially early on when developing. First of all, if you have a sales team that's functioning 100%, it's the biggest lever. Early on, I would argue it may actually be the biggest lever as well, assuming you don't make a totally bad hire. Because I've seen average sales reps be top performers when they're properly enabled and there's a strong operations component to the sales organization. You probably have too. I've also seen it the other way. I mean, think about yourself. Like, have you ever known a salesperson who's gone to a company totally flopped, but you know they're really good? I have,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right? And what's the difference there? That's the same person, right? There's this operations and enablement component that becomes a lot more of a driver of performance than people give it credit for.
Yeah, that raises a couple of things. And you mentioned earlier kind of the difference between transactional and kind of consultative sales, and then also this taking high performance and all of a sudden seeing them flounder or struggle. When we built Customer Link back in many years ago, which ultimately merged with Demandforce under Intuit, as it turned out. But all three founders or co-founders, we all had very successful enterprise sales backgrounds. We were in big software sales and ERP, things like that, and had a lot of success. And then when we started Customer Link, it was a far more transactional sale model. The price points were lower. Everything was different about the sales model, but we felt like, we're super successful in sales and this is going to be the easy part for the company. It turned out that it was really challenging for us to create efficiency and effectiveness in a transactional model, despite our success in enterprise model. I don't know. I don't think you can necessarily just apply experience universally and expect it to work out for you. I mean, is that a pretty common thing that you see?
Oh, I see it all the time. Yeah. Well, why do you think it was challenging? Was it just strictly going to transactional sales and you were familiar with these longer sales cycles?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was, we came from, the longer sales cycles with where you had multiple pillars of strength in an organization you had to go build, right? You're doing a lot more relationship work. You're doing a lot more discovery around problems and impact of those problems, and how to create solution points that made sense for a group of decision makers. And all of a sudden, we're thrust into this situation where a single small business owner, is making a decision, and you've got to very quickly make your value proposition, make it resonate for the person. And it was just different. And I think also as we were recruiting, it was problematic because we were looking for people that maybe had a level of professionalism or exuded a certain amount of gravitas. And at the end of the day, that didn't matter at all. In fact, some of our most successful reps ultimately were really quirky, people that just were good on the phone or that they were able to capture attention. And so.
Yeah, it's funny. I've always said I like to hire characters. I like those quirky, strange salespeople because they tend to do very well. But it's interesting, yeah, you bring all that up because when you go very transactional, even in a B2B sale, I find it's very similar to a business to consumer sale. And when you scroll through
Yes.
Instagram, you're going to hear some sales coach talking about like closing lines and oh, I need to talk to my wife. And here's how you overcome that objection. And it's so aggressive and uncomfortable to listen to for the average person. And I mean, even for me, like I don't love that kind of stuff. I don't like it, but I did it for a long time. And that's the weird thing is I might hear a tactic like that, like, oh, well, would your wife have a problem with you getting in shape? It's like it almost feels manipulative, but I've
Right.
also seen them work really well. And at that stage, like when you're selling gym memberships, for example, a lot of times you're thinking this person's they're trying to change their life, right? Like they're out of shape, they're going to get in shape. It's going to have a dramatic impact on their family, on their work life, their entire life could change. So it's coming from a good place. I think in the vast majority of situations, I think there's definitely places where it's not. But the vast majority of situations, the person selling is trying to do the right thing, and they're using these tactics to get somebody to make a decision that they should make because they really believe it's the right decision for them. That is so foreign as you go up market. I mean, could you imagine that in an enterprise sale, someone's going to spend $1 million a year? It's not happening. So it's just a different world. And I laugh when I see these, when I go through these, like Instagram influencers that talk about sales because I can acknowledge that it works, but man, it's pretty foreign from the world that I live in, with the exception of these very transactional sales.
Yeah, it's very foreign to me too, and I think that was one of the things that I experienced, at least in that customer experience, was it was uncomfortable, and so when we would coach or when we would recruit, I think we naturally would gravitate to a different style, right? A more conversational, slower
Yes.
role, and yeah, that didn't always work well in that situation, right? Our model was needed to be more transactional, and it wasn't like you know 10 trick closes and things like that,
Right,
but
right.
it was very quickly sussing out what the customer is interested in and where they had needs, and then quickly making a value proposition and trying to wrap it versus nurturing it and establishing a relationship and all of that.
And that's a good point you brought up around hiring because you guys have a lens. You prefer that type of salesperson. You're also
Right.
trained to sell like that. So you gravitate to those type of people. That happens when you don't have sales experience. So like a founder who's hiring their first sales rep, yeah, I mean, so often they just hire the person that they bonded with the most, and not necessarily the right person for them to hire. Sometimes it is, but often it's not. And I run into sometimes with folks who like to hire commission only teams. I'm not a huge fan of that, but a commission only salesperson, if you've worked with enough of them, it's the same persona, right? They all kind of sell the same, and they're very aggressive. And some of them are super driven. They do really well and they thrive in that environment. It is not the environment that I like to create when I build sales teams. So I stay away from the commission only. But when you interview people, if you come from that background, you might look for those types of people. And for those of us like you and I who have sold these larger deals, that is not what it takes to get a large deal done.
Right.
It's so much more about competency and being able to understand the complex world of their organization and how they operate and what cords you need to pull and when you need to bring them in. Like it's so much more strategic and detail oriented that you can't be a bull in a china shop to actually get progress a deal forward. It's so much more complicated than that. So anybody
Yes.
who's building a sales team needs to think, what is the type of person that drives this sale, not what's the type of person that makes me feel the most comfortable, because oftentimes those two don't really go together.
This is a really interesting topic for me, and I know you've got a ton of experience here, so I'm eager to double click on this. Um, Recruiting for salespeople can be really challenging, right? I mean, inherently there's different models, and like you said, you're maybe looking through your own lenses around what made me successful in the past in sales, and then applying it, even though it doesn't really fit the model as I experienced. And then also you're at least, when you're talking to more seasoned candidates, they're sellers, and so they're selling you.
Right.
And how do you parse through that? I mean, first, like, maybe how do you get really clear on what the profile is of the individual, or the characteristics and soft skills and all of that, and then how do you parse through the sales of it?
Yeah, I heard a good quote. I think it was from Gary Vee. I don't know if he originated this quote, but what do they say? Hiring is guessing, firing is knowing. So I think at a certain level, that will be true. Um, you just don't want to be caught in a situation where you're not sure if the rep's the problem, right? Because sometimes you hire a rep, it's not working out well. You're like, are they not good? Are our leads
Right.
bad? Do we not have the right messaging? Is my product crappy? Am I a terrible leader? Like, you have all these externals. It's like hard for me to point the finger at this person, right? Because everything else is chaotic. So you never want to be in that situation. But the point that you brought up about the ideal candidate profile is so important, because you need to decide that before you start interviewing people. And you need to be taking your experience with that sales rep and referencing the ideal candidate profile and make sure that they check all of the boxes. So there's a bunch of ways to do this, but you should map out the characteristics that you're looking for in a salesperson, which and what level of experience that you want. Are they more motivated by money or more motivated by their career, right? You should map out what that person looks like, what their motivators are, what kind of experience do they have? Do they have a book of business or do they not? And then you should also consider their past history of success. Are you looking for somebody more junior who might not have a lot of examples of that? But if there's somebody 5 years in sales, like, you should know their track record. Have they been successful before in the past? Now, they're going to sugarcoat that anyway, but you should at least have an idea of what you're looking for. And then when you interview the folks, you look back at that and you say, okay, yeah, this person is a lot more career motivated, which might be good for me at the time, because I would like to hire someone that I can see progressing within the organization. But sometimes you don't. Sometimes you're like, I need somebody money motivated to just execute on the thing day in and day out. I don't need them getting creative with different scripts. I need them to execute on this playbook. Well, then you're looking for somebody a little bit more money motivated. And as long as you're cross-referencing, you're going to put yourself in the best position to hire the right person. And then if you have the rest of the stuff built out, so you have scripts, you have the daily workflow they need to follow, then when they're in the seat, you can make that decision in a couple of months. Like, it's not a big deal if you hire someone that doesn't work out in 3 months. Like, it sucks. Like, no one likes, spending money that they didn't get a return on. But it's business. This is what happens. Sometimes it doesn't work out. The problem is when you let that person, that 3 month mark, stay to the 4, stay to the 5, stay to the 8 month mark. That
Right.
is really bad. Because
Bad
now,
for the company, bad for the team, and even for the individual, right?
right, right. Oh, totally. Yeah, yeah. The individual is another point too. That, like, it's not fair to them to be locked in a place where they feel like they're not doing good and they're not enough. Gosh, should I even be in sales anymore? Like, it's so horrible. But if you if you can make that decision earlier because you have the rest of these components in place, it usually goes a lot smoother. I don't mind having to let go a rep after a couple of months if it's not a good fit. I don't like it, but it's not the end of the world. It's the end of the world is when I talk to a founder who's had someone there for 12 months, they've closed one deal. That's a problem.
Yeah, and having been in that situation, and always feeling maybe too slow to fire, right? And especially in the sales where there's maybe uncertainty around it. To your point earlier, like, is it about me? Is it about our coaching? Is it the product? I mean, yeah. And so I think all of that to me kind of stems back to, what is the model, and how do you recommend companies approach building their model? Like, I mean, this goes back to, is this going to be consultative? Is it transactional? What kind of activities do I, assume lead to a sale? Are there key assumptions and validation points that should be considered when you're building the model?
Yeah, what I like to do is I like to figure out what number I need the team to hit to justify keeping the team. For everybody, this looks different, but you need a number where you're like, hey, if we hit this number, and it's going to be way lower than what your quota should be, but if we hit this number, at least I can keep this team and we have a foundation we can work from. So it's almost a break-even number. It should be a bit more than that. You have to do the math yourself, but you do the math and figure out, at a bare minimum, the team needs to generate 500K in ARR over the 12-month period, let's say. Okay, cool. I hired 2 reps. I'm expecting them to do at least 500K. Their quota should probably be 1.5 million or something.
Okay, right.
But I need that like baseline, because then you're getting the data and you can better understand when I do X amount of activity, I get Y outcome. And that relationship between activity and outcome is so important to understand, especially early on, because that's what you're going to build the rest of your team off of. So when you're first building the team, you set a baseline number that you're like, I just have to get to this. And then you do the math, and I'll walk through it here in a minute, on what it would take to hit that number. So how many activities do they have to do? So let's do cold calling because it's just easy for me. They do 1,000 cold calls. And if we have 5% answering the phone, and then 10% of those people will book a meeting with us, and 30% of the people who take a meeting will actually close. Now I have numbers to be able to say how many activities do they have to do on a daily basis in order to hit that 500K. And once you have that number, you go, okay, while we're doing our outreach and the team is operating, I'm looking at the numbers and saying, are we hitting that 5% dial to connect rate? Am I hitting that 10% people who answer the phone actually book a meeting with us? Am I hitting the show up rate that I need them to? Like 70% of the meetings actually show up. And are we hitting the win rate that we need to? And if you're not, based on the model, then that's where you dive in and start making some improvements. And then from there, you can say, all right, these areas need to be improved, start improving those areas. And now we start looking at the numbers that are possible based on the improvements that we're going to make to our baseline. And if you operate like that, at least you'll have clarity of what the bottlenecks are and what you need to do to fix the overall performance of the team.
So all of that, I mean, supposedly you start with just assumptions. You're starting with some guesses, or maybe based on your own founder-led sales, maybe to shape what you believe those sequences look like, and maybe those conversion points. Is that where you start?
Yeah, you need to get some numbers to be able to figure the whole thing out. So I generally recommend doing it as the founder. And then as you understand those numbers, you could bring someone in to replicate them. That's the ideal situation. But some founders don't have, the
right, your technical founder or something like that.
Exactly, yeah. Right. A lot of times you run into this with venture-backed companies too, where they have the capital to hire a team. Running a sales team is very different than running any type of other organization. Like if you have SDRs, good luck just meeting with them once a week.
Right.
Not gonna do anything. I mean, same with salespeople. Like you need to be regularly reviewing the pipeline, and once you have that foundational process, so as you're more mature as a sales organization, the game really becomes pipeline hygiene. Holding your team accountable to what deals are actually live and which ones are need to be marked closed lost. A lot of the game becomes pipeline hygiene. But before that, it's a ton of, hey, what metrics can we look at so that way we can enable you with different resources or change our process a little bit. So an example that comes up a lot is qualification. Like a lot of times sales reps will waste time talking deals that aren't qualified. And let's say you have 3 deal stages, and you increase the level of qualification. So that means you're going to be talking to less people. Well, the percentages of deal stage 1 to deal stage 2 and deal stage 2 to deal stage 3 should go up, because now you're talking to higher quality people. What sometimes happens is you increase the qualifications to try to increase the quality of appointments that the sales team is managing and the deals that they're working, but you don't see that increase in percentage. It wasn't a qualification issue. Yeah, they might have been talking to some people that weren't qualified, but these percentages didn't improve. So it was actually better to talk to the volume in
right.
Because you're going to get more going through the pipeline. But if you're not measuring that and you're just anecdotally saying, oh, it's a lead quality issue, well, it might not be, and they could totally change your results. So those types of things are important to be careful of, but there's a long-standing tradition of just saying things as sales leaders without looking at the data to back it up, and also what metrics we're trying to improve later, that it can be, you get steered astray pretty easily.
I'm curious about that. I'd like to explore that further. So, I mean, sometimes you gravitate to that sales leader who maybe is the exceptional coach, and they spend a lot of time with role playing and scripting and training, if you will. And then there's those that are maybe more data driven and focused on the pipeline, things like that. I mean, as you've seen so many, what does an exceptional sales leader and sales manager possess and do that makes them unique and consistently effective versus maybe just the good coach?
Yeah, and I agree with what you just said. Like there's almost two camps. There's the people leader, great coach, tons of tactics, does training really well, and then there's that data nerdy person. And it's rare that you find someone who possesses both, but that's really like the ideal person, understands the data very well and is an incredible coach. But the data stuff you can get by with rev ops and sales operations. So you have somebody who's looking at that data and is able to instruct that sales leader with, hey, here's the area the team is struggling with. Let's do coaching around that. That's the ideal situation. I prefer the great coach sales leader. I prefer it because I think it is what's needed in the sales organization to get consistency. The data will help draw your eyes to where what needs to be improved, but to have consistency, you need somebody, you need a sheepdog that can keep everybody sort of on the right path. Now, not looking at the data means that that person's going to end up trying a bunch of things. It's going to take them forever to get to a place to where they're consistent sometimes. Other times you're just somebody figured it out and it's great. So the data will just prevent all of the trial and error, make it a little bit easier for that leader to be effective. So I prefer those two roles if I had to pick. But of course, if you can find somebody who understands the data and can sit with the team coach and keep them,
Sure,
inspired, man, I mean, that's a wicked combo.
yeah, maybe a bit of a unicorn, but yeah,
Yeah, probably.
when you're
There's more
finding
than found.
yeah, when you're looking for the RevOps role in particular, there's a spectrum there, right? There's a very tactical RevOps person who can string together your systems and make sure they're communicating well and build your dashboards, and then there's the kind of strategic level that's able to interpret data and identify white space and opportunities. Do you tend to gravitate to one or the other, or is it dependent upon the
It
leader?
depends on the founder, really. Like if you're somebody who is comfortable analyzing data and can take it. I mean, I remember when I was running the SDR team at the fintech company. I had done this big data analysis that I totally botched. I didn't even know how to use Excel. It was a nightmare. And the founder caught my math mistakes so fast. And afterwards, I went up to him. I was definitely bruised and beaten up. But I went up to him afterwards. I said, "Hey, I just have to ask you, how were you able to identify that so quickly?" Because it was completely foreign to me. Like you pull up a bunch of numbers, and I'm just like, "Yes, it's great." It's just like totally crazy. And he didn't really know. He was like, I just could tell the math was wrong. It just stood out to me. It was just a
Right.
number I just felt weird about. I didn't have that. Now, as far as like what type of RevOps person is the best fit, if the founder has that ability and can look at numbers and say, all right, we're changing this. We want to make this kind of change. What do we expect to improve? And can instruct that person to do the math and figure out the impact of improving that metric, fine. But if not, I prefer the insights person because it's not that difficult to get systems to talk to each other. That part they can learn and might take them longer than somebody who's really comfortable with it because they have to like read stuff or look up tutorials, but they'll figure it out. The dangerous part is not being able to look at the data and say, that's the area we should probably focus because if we make this improvement, then we can expect this kind of revenue increase. That's the more important skill, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm a pretty analytical
Yeah.
person, and I know you've seen some of my models, but despite that, I still try to or tend to gravitate to that more strategic person as well because oftentimes I feel like, and I'm not in it day to day. I'm not
Right.
living it, and if it's relying on me to draw out the observations. We might miss something. And so
Right.
I tend to go towards the strategic as well.
And it depends on the team. So maybe it's worth mentioning this. So if a company has SDRs, SDR data is a little bit more simple. You have your general like activities that they've done, number of people who've responded to an email, answered a cold call, right? Responded to LinkedIn, amount of meetings that got booked, the show ups, the qualification of those meetings. Like that's a pretty simple data set to look at. And then every now and then you're like, let me look at cold calls, and I need to look at outcome of call distribution, or I need to look at the lead statuses that all of our leads are in. Like there's these little deeper things that you can sort of dive into. For sales teams, it can get a lot more complicated because there's a bunch of different sources. There might be partner channels. There might be regular referrals and inbound, then outbound. And so it starts getting a lot more complicated. And then there's drop off between stages, and then there's close lost reason, and then there's close won reason, and then there's time and stage. So it gets a lot more complicated once you start talking about the sales process itself. And I generally I find the bigger challenge and the easier one to solve is with that SDR function, because the data is a lot simpler and you can sort of push through a lot of plateaus by just talking to more people. So the better we operate there, generally we have more volume, and that can we'll kick the can a little bit down the road, because I know organizations that hit 10 million in ARR and their operations is a mess. But man, are they good at generating appointments. They're so good at it that the volume may cause, I don't know, cause them, but let them overlook the challenges they had around operations. So, kind of goes both ways.
I mean, not to pick on Demand Force back in the day, but I mean, I think it was a great sales engine, and maybe despite operations or the product even wasn't super mature, but it had wild success because it had kind of a Viking ship mentality around sales. I mean, just
Big time. And we've
yeah,
seen a ton of this where the product is just not that great, but the sales function is so dialed that they're able to push through that. But they'll only get so far, and back then too, because buyers are much more mature now to software sales and than they were back then. And I think the more mature and skeptical the buyer becomes, the more burden it puts on the product, but also the sales process too. So today might be a little bit different, but we've all seen companies that are able to push through it. But there's a cap. They end up getting to a
right,
place where now their number one challenge is the product and they need
right.
to make these big improvements to the product because they're not able to grow past their churn numbers. So it eventually catches up, and maybe back then it would catch up at 30 million in ARR, and now it's catching up to about 10 million
10,
in
yeah,
ARR. It just depends on the competency of the sales leader.
yeah, totally agree with that. And I think there's those natural inflection points, and you're probably right. It's just kind of compressed it, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably. We'll see. There's still bad products out there, so
At the risk of oversimplifying, your perspective on it, do you view sales ultimately as a number game? I mean, is success really determined by activity, assuming that your messaging and your audience is clear?
yeah, look, if I have to pick between a numbers game and not a numbers game, it's obviously a numbers game. And there's a debate, right? And maybe people listening have seen this before, where it's like, oh, is sales a numbers game? Sales isn't a number game. It's like all these people debate, but I just feel like it's a silly debate because obviously sales is a numbers game. There's activities and then there's outcomes. And then there's a relationship between those two things. And the greatest predictor of future pipeline are today's activities. So we have leading indicators and lagging indicators. You're foolish to think it's not a numbers game, but that doesn't mean it's not also a people game. Like there's not, it's not a
Right.
binary thing here. The numbers are so critical. Let me just put it this way. I see way more that don't do the numbers part very well and don't see success than I see companies that do the number parts really well and don't see success. So the numbers are the bedrock. Now, of course, you'll have reps like, oh, they have a daily minimum of 100 calls. They'll just make 30 fake cold calls at the end of the day to catch up with it. Yeah, I guess. But that person's not going to hit their number. And if we can't make 100 cold calls in a day, someone's either lazy or we're not enabling them to be able to do so. So it's either them or us. So figure out which one it is, because 100 cold calls in a day is not very much at all. So that's how I think about it is I need to enable the team to do a certain amount of numbers. I need these numbers in order to hit the outcomes that I'm trying to hit. And I also need those people who are doing the numbers, who are making the calls,
Right.
sending the emails, talking to our prospects, to be in the best emotional state I can possibly have them in, because that's going to give us bigger returns on that effort. But if I don't know the numbers behind that, then it becomes very difficult for me to do anything. So yeah, I think sales is a numbers game first.
Yeah, you hit a couple things there that are interesting to me. I think oftentimes, if you're not in from sales, right? If it's say you're an engineering founder or a technical founder, you don't necessarily know what a rational number of sales per day is, and then with the advent of like dialers and things like that, I mean, the ability to pound out a bunch of calls and even a lot of connections is much greater than it was in the past. You're in a really interesting vantage point to see what's possible and realistic. How would you advise folks that are not as close to sales to get to that information, to know what's possible and what, should be the appropriate targets?
So the first thing I'll say here is I feel like whoever's running the sales org, their opinions of that role dictate what they're expecting of the people they hire to do it. So because the founder does not like receiving cold calls and would be very uncomfortable to cold call, they're very uncomfortable hiring people to do cold calls. Therefore, they don't hold those teams accountable to the activity that's required in order to hit the number.
That is a super powerful statement and insight. I'm so glad you
Yeah,
brought that
yeah,
up.
yeah. It's a little deep we got there. That is such a critical component here. So, for example, myself personally, I like cold calls. I like them quite a bit. They're fun. Each person's a puzzle, and I'm trying to figure out if I can solve the puzzle. And if I get hung up on, I'm like, shoot, you know, dang it. I will call them in a couple of days. Let's see if I can get this person to go a little further. Like, it's kind of fun for me. Did I love making 100 to 120 cold calls a day? No, I didn't love that role. I wanted to get promoted as much as I could, but I enjoyed it while I was there. I enjoyed trying to figure people out. So when I run a sales team, I don't have that same, oh, this is going to suck for you. Oh, I know it's such a grind cold calling every day. I don't feel that way. Is it kind of a grind? Sure. But also it's sort of fun. I like listening to the cold calls, trying to figure out what we could have said differently, right? So that is such a critical component here. I always tell people I expect, like cold calling, for example, at least 100 cold calls a day. There are reasons why you would be less than that. Maybe it's a more complex sale. You have to be a little more strategic with your outreach. That's totally fine if the workflow demands it. But what I generally see is we're calling into the SMB or the mid-market. We're expecting 50 calls a day. We're researching people before we call them, and we're burning a bunch of time sending emails and stuff when they don't have to be doing that. Everyone's workflow will look a little different. My point is I see a lot of that. So I always start at 100 cold calls a day, and you need to convince me to move this number lower, or we need to use dialers and things to make it higher. And when you have that, you can then model out based on 100 cold calls a day what you would, what you could possibly get to. But anyway, that's how I think about it.
I think that's fantastic insight. And as you were talking about that, I mean, I can absolutely identify times when I have asserted my viewpoint or my belief system around that, and because as a seller, even, I mean, I love being in a deal, especially a consultative deal, and that requires strategic thinking and problem solving. But I really don't enjoy prospecting. Never really have. I don't love picking up the phone, and so I do tend to see that position as a grind. I mean, my natural instinct is like, oh, that would be a hard job. And so then I put that on there, right? And I think the insight you just provided, which is, get out of the way, figure out what's rational and is a good target, and don't be bashful about setting a high target.
Oh yeah, totally. And those people who are at that point of their career, like they want to move to a different role. They want to get promoted, or they want to do really well. Like, have you ever met a solar guy who was making a ton of money and came home and said, "Oh, it was such a grind knocking on doors all day"? No, they're just like, "I make a fortune," you know.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It's like,
Yeah, they're
oh,
not worried about the number of calls.
yeah, like there's a story about this I heard from Tony Robbins when I was young. I heard this, and it really stuck out to me. Where he tells a story. He was driving through through a toll booth, going on a bridge, and he gets to the toll booth, and the person who takes the money for the toll was in a really good mood. Hey, good morning! Like super excited, took his money, gave him the change. All right, have a beautiful day. And Tony goes to drive off, and he kind of pulls over off to the side. He runs to the toll booth guy and says, "Hey, just quick question here. Like, this is a pretty brutal job. It seems like you just stand in this little booth all day. It's pretty hot out, and you're just taking money from, people. Like, why are you so happy?" And the guy's response was, "I have a beautiful wife. I have amazing kids. Yeah, I mean, is this the greatest experience standing in this little booth all day? Maybe not, but I don't work on the weekends. I get to spend time with my family." He was happy. And then there's so many times where we project how we would feel in a certain situation onto that person, but we don't know their belief systems. We don't know how they kind of find meaning in their own experience,
That's right.
or what
That's
their
right.
goals are. When I was an SDR, I wanted to get promoted, and I would have done anything. I was so driven to get promoted. I was so nervous that I wasn't going to make it through the SDR program and wasn't going to get promoted to an account executive. And I had these weird beliefs about not going to college and what that meant for me. And I thought if I didn't make it through this, then I would be some loser working at wherever, and barely making enough money to get by. So I was so worried about that I had a ton of drive to push through what might have been a bit uncomfortable. And through that, I found that I actually quite enjoy this one little part of it. And I had a lot of fun. I mean, anybody who's been on an SDR team knows, like, it can be a pretty fun time. You're joking around with your friends. You're talking about calls that didn't go well. Like, you have a bit of a community there. To have a leader be like weird and touchy because they feel like that my role isn't all that exciting would have definitely have rubbed me the wrong way. And it might not even have been conscious, but I would have felt it, and it would have impacted the culture. And then you don't get the performance levels that you want. It almost goes back to what you asked earlier. Like, is it really a numbers game? Kinda, but you can crush an entire team by just being a weirdo, and like all and having all this pent up stuff, because it prevents you from wanting to listen to calls, right?
Right.
Most owners won't listen to cold calls because they kind of cringe when they hear it.
Right.
It's like, how do you give them feedback? Anyway, so that kind of stuff I think has a really big impact, but sort of the unsung destroyer of that function.
Yeah. The power of perspective. I mean, I just love that. Super good. I am curious. One thing I want to touch on before we break here is what do you see as the future of sales? I mean, there's so many technologies and tools that are now available. I mean, even back to the days that I've sold and compared to now, I mean, it's just so much. One, it's hard to sort through it all, but two, it feels like there's so many promises of the new thing that's going to disrupt sales. And now there's AI on the forefront, and the ability, maybe, well, at the very least, to be popping scripts that maybe are more poignant, or doing sentiment analysis. And then ultimately, even the promise of, well, you're not going to need sales reps, you're not going to need SDRs because AI is going to do it. What's your perspective on all of that, and where do you see the sales profession headed?
I have a belief that people prefer to buy from people. And of course, if you poll somebody and say, would you rather talk to a salesperson or just buy the product? They'll say, I'll just buy the product. But how come salespeople work so well? I walk into a mall and there's people trying to clean my shoes so they can sell me shoe cleaner. I mean, that's a pretty commoditized product that they sell on Amazon.
Right.
But there's a whole group of people who just sell that to you. And I think it's going to take way longer than people think to actually be able to replace a salesperson, even the SDR function. I mean, you're seeing the email stuff replaced, sure, but like, I think the cold calls are pretty far off. And I'll reserve the right to be wrong. But you know what? I have this. Maybe this will be helpful. This is a 100-year-old sales book. Have I shown you this, Mark?
No, I don't believe
Oh,
so.
you're going to love this. It's called Salesmanship. Ferris and Collins wrote this book. And here's what's cool. It just turned 100. We had a big celebration. 1924 is when this was printed. Kind of unbelievable. So you go through, and there's all of these, like, there's a great wisdom in here. It's a little bit there's a lot of misogyny in here too. But
For sure.
here's
Yeah.
my favorite part of the book, and I reference this often. Tell me if AI is doing this. Enthusiasm is contagious. Feeling imparts feeling. It spreads like conflagration. The enthusiasm of the salesperson is communicated to the prospect during every stage of the sale, but it reaches a climax when he holds up his offering before the prospect in the form of a vivid description or picture. Intense feeling radiates from his eyes, his face, his voice, his attitude. The prospect absorbs it. It's one of the imponderable forces of salesmanship. It is especially effective at stimulating desire. Enthusiasm 100 years ago
Right.
is one of the most important things for salespeople to have. Has that changed all that much?
Not at
No,
all.
not at all. And I just don't know if it'll hit the same coming from a computer as it does when I'm in front of you, or I'm talking to you on the phone, or I'm on a Zoom call with you. And because of that, I think it's going to take a lot longer than people think for this AI stuff. It's like the last 10% takes the longest, right? The first 90, it's also not as impactful. It has a huge impact, but that last 10 is really what changes everything. It takes a lot longer for that last 10, and I still don't know how long until it gets to that point.
Yeah. Yeah, I share the same outlook, and I'm certainly not ready to replace people with technology. I see it as a great way to augment what they're doing, or to empower them, or create more efficiency. But as a full replacement, I don't see it yet either.
If anything, I just see it as a way for a lot more people to start businesses with a lot less friction, which
Right.
maybe we all start working for a lot smaller companies. Maybe that creates an environment where there's a lot more consolidation happening, these larger companies acquiring smaller ones. Either way, I think generally people like working with people. So to replace everything with AI, there's going to be a couple of folks that are just like, hey, I'm a one man band. But I know a lot more founders who enjoy working with folks. They might not want to run a 100-person company, but they want some
Right.
people around them that they're building with, than I do people who just want to be a recluse and do everything by themselves. So because of that, there's still, I think, for a long time, that human need to collaborate. You'll collaborate within your companies, but I think you'll also collaborate on sales. And I'm not looking at it as much more disruptive than some other folks are looking at it as.
Yeah. And on the tool front, with this kind of proliferation of tools available, are you one to, say, adopt as much as you can on this, or are you more of the thinking, you know what, at the end of the day, kind of goes back to that salesmanship, being enthusiastic, doing the basic blocking and tackling, doing the activity? What's your thinking there?
We have a mutual friend, Dan Martell, that says simple scales. And I find that a lot of these sales tools adds complexity to the workflow of the salespeople, which reduces their efficiency. So I try to keep a very streamlined approach when it comes to what technology that we're using, and use as little as possible. And then you add tools to solve problems that are very specific problems that need to be solved. So no, I'm not big on getting a whole bunch of sales tools. I think call recordings is mandatory, so that's definitely great. The rest of the stuff, I mean, of course, like, you need data. Like, there's some mandatory things, but those things have been around for quite a bit. These like AI sales co-pilots, I think, are cool, and I don't know how expensive. I know some of them are more expensive than others, but I feel like that's sort of a race to the bottom. So anyway, we'll see if that stuff becomes the norm. I will say I do like having a little AI support when I'm constructing, an email, and there's a bunch of call recordings I need analyzed. ChatGPT does a lot of this right out of the box. Anyway, we'll see it. As AI gets implemented into every tool on the planet, I feel like it's just going to be a massive consolidation. It's kind of like what we're seeing with Zoom. Slack's doing this kind of stuff. Like, Zoom has chat now to compete with Slack. They're doing call recording, so they're kind of building out. They think they just rebranded themselves as Zoom Workforce or something, Workplace. I don't know. And then you have Slack doing the same thing. They add huddles, and now they just added tasks. I mean, they call it lists. So you're seeing all these companies trying to build the feature set that would compete with what their customers are using other tools for, just to make their tools more sticky. Microsoft has been doing this forever. You know, they acquire a lot of companies in order to do this too. So we'll see what actually ends up happening. But I find that the more simple tech stack is the correct one until you get to a certain point where you need it to enable the team to solve a specific problem.
That's great. Thank you. Before we break off, I want to kind of put a plug in for yourself and for all the content and value that you put out into the world. For those listening, definitely check out Kyle's content. He puts out great videos on YouTube. You can check out some details there. You're also very frequently running online learning webinars. They're talking about sales related topics, and whether it be around recruiting or enablement and everything in between. So definitely recommend people check all of that out. In addition to that, Kyle, how should people follow you and connect with you?
Yeah, on LinkedIn, Kyle Vamvouris. That's basically where I'm at everywhere. We do a lot of content on YouTube. You can check that out. And like you said, we do this weekly live class where I cover a topic that's specific to how to build out a sales organization or improve your existing sales organization. They're free. They're awesome. I spend a lot of time making sure that the content's as impactful as it can. So check those out. But otherwise, I'm around. People find me.
Fantastic. Yeah, I can vouch for the quality of those and encourage everybody to take advantage of it. Kyle, thank you so much for the time. I mean, I could go on all day talking sales with you, but I think that there was some really good takeaways here and some great insights that you shared.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it.